It was a blustery morning in the spring of 1982, the kind of Iowa wind that cut straight through a worn denim jacket and made the dust dance across the gravel driveway. The air carried that familiar mix of dry earth, diesel, and worry. The heavy kind of worry that had settled over every farm in the county, like a thick blanket no one could shake off. Evelyn Harper stood at the back of their old, faded blue pickup truck, her hands gentle but steady as she lifted crate after crate of 200-day-old chicks. The tiny yellow balls of fluff cheeped loudly, a fragile sound against the harsh howl of the prairie wind. At 41 years old, Evelyn moved with quiet purpose, her apron already dusted with feed and her hair pulled back under a faded kerchief. She had saved for months from egg money and garden sales to buy these chicks, every penny earned without borrowing a single dollar from the bank. Her husband Tom leaned against the barn door with his arms crossed, shaking his head slowly. He was a big man, strong from years of field work, but the last few years had carved deep lines of stress into his face. "Evelyn, what in the world are you doing?" He called out, his voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. 200 chickens. We're fighting to keep the tractor running, and you're bringing home more mouths to feed. From the fence line, two neighboring farmers, Harlan and Dale, watched the scene unfold. Their laughter carried across the yard, loud and mocking in the morning air. "Look at that," Harlan shouted with a grin. "Your wife's starting a petting zoo while the rest of us are trying to stay in business." Dale slapped his knee. "Next thing you know, she'll be selling eggs to pay the mortgage. Good luck with that when the bank comes calling." The laughter stung, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She kept unloading the crates, moving them carefully into the old toolshed she had cleaned out the night before. Around them, the farm told its own quiet story of struggle. The field stretched out under a gray sky, soil already showing signs of wear from years of heavy debt and uncertain prices. Equipment sat idle near the barn, some pieces broken and waiting for parts they couldn't afford. The 1980s farm crisis was tightening its grip on rural Iowa. Interest rates were skyrocketing, land values were crashing, and every month brought another letter from the bank that made stomachs turn. Most farmers in the county, including Tom, believed the only way forward was to borrow more. Bigger tractors, more land, more inputs. "Go big or go home," the dealers and extension agents kept saying. But Evelyn had watched her grandmother survive the hard times of the 1930s with nothing but a few chickens and a garden. While the men debated expensive solutions, she saw something different, a small, steady source of income that didn't require taking on more debt. As the wind whipped across the yard, scattering bits of straw and dust, Evelyn closed the shed door on her new flock. The laughter from the neighbors slowly faded as they drove away, still chuckling. Tom stood silent for a long moment, staring at his wife. He loved her deeply, but in that moment he truly believed she was wasting precious time and money they didn't have. Little did any of them know. Not Tom, not the laughing neighbors, not even Evelyn herself on that windy spring morning, that those 200 tiny chicks would one day become the very thing that stood between their family and the loss of everything they had worked for. Tom and Evelyn Harper had been married for 22 years, a union built on deep love and shared hard work, yet now strained by the relentless pressure of the times. Tom was the kind of man everyone in the county respected, broad-shouldered, honest, and tireless in the field. At 43, he still carried himself with the confidence of a man who had once been the best young farmer in the township. He believed in progress. When the agricultural extension agents and John Deere dealers spoke about bigger equipment and expansion through debt, Tom listened carefully. "You've got to grow or die," he would say at the kitchen table, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee. To him, the solution was clear. Borrow money for a newer tractor, rent more ground, and push harder. That was how a real farmer stayed ahead. Evelyn, by contrast, moved through life with a quieter kind of strength. She was not loud or flashy. Her wisdom came from watching her grandmother survive the Dust Bowl years with little more than a garden and a small flock of chickens. While Tom looked to the future with borrowed money, Evelyn looked to the lessons of the past. She believed in owning what you had outright and creating income from whatever resources were already on the place. No new debt, no big risks. Just steady, honest work that paid for itself quickly. She rarely argued with Tom, but her determination showed in small, persistent actions. Canning extra vegetables, selling eggs at the roadside, and now bringing home those 200 chicks. Their marriage had always been a good one, filled with respect and affection. Tom adored his wife's gentle spirit and the way she could make a warm meal out of almost nothing. Evelyn admired her husband's work ethic and the way he protected their family. But the farm crisis was driving a wedge between their two philosophies. Evenings that used to be peaceful now ended in heavy silence. Tom would spread out loan papers under the kitchen light, calculating interest rates that kept climbing higher every month. Evelyn would sit across from him, darning socks or planning her chicken coop, saying little but thinking plenty. The tension on the Harper farm was growing like a storm cloud on the horizon. The old tractor had broken down twice that spring already, repairs eating into money they barely had. Corn prices had fallen again, and the latest letter from the bank sat unopened on the counter like a bad omen. Tom felt the weight of responsibility crushing him. He believed taking on more debt was the only way to save their 240 acres. Evelyn, meanwhile, saw debt as the very trap that was pulling so many neighbors under. She wanted to build something small, something they truly owned, something that could weather whatever hard times were coming. As the days passed after she brought the chicks home, the conflict between them remained unspoken but deeply felt. Tom worried his wife was being unrealistic. Evelyn worried her husband was putting their future at risk. Neither wanted to lose the farm they had poured their lives into, yet both sensed that the choices they made in these difficult years would determine whether their family survived the storm or became another statistic in the spreading farm crisis. What Evelyn understood, in a way many of her neighbors did not, was the quiet power of something small, fast, and self-supporting. Chickens made perfect sense to her in the middle of the 1982 farm crisis. For just a few $100s, money she had saved herself over many months, she could start an operation that would begin producing income in weeks instead of seasons. Unlike corn or soybeans that tied up land and capital for months with no guarantee of profit, chickens offered quick returns through eggs and eventually meat. They required very little space, turned kitchen scraps and garden waste into income, and most importantly, they did not demand taking on new bank debt. Evelyn approached the project with the practical wisdom passed down from her grandmother, who had kept a small flock through the Great Depression. She claimed an old, unused toolshed on the north side of the barn, a weathered building everyone else had written off as junk. Using scrap lumber from fallen fences, old chicken wire Tom had discarded years earlier, and wooden crates from the co-op, she built sturdy nesting boxes and roosts. She mixed her own feed using cracked corn, wheat middlings, and greens from the garden, just as her grandmother had taught her. Within days, the old shed was transformed into a clean, efficient laying house. The floor was covered with fresh straw from the barn, and she installed simple waterers made from old buckets and simple feeders hung from the ceiling. There was no fancy equipment, no expensive heaters or automatic systems. Just honest, handmade solutions that cost almost nothing but time and care. Evelyn worked early in the morning and late in the evening, tending to the chicks with a patience that seemed old-fashioned to those around her. She kept detailed notes in an old notebook, how much feed they consumed, which breeds were laying best, and simple health remedies using garlic and apple cider vinegar. This approach stood in sharp contrast to what most farmers in the county were doing. While Evelyn invested in something small and paid for, her neighbors, including Tom, were pouring money into bigger tractors, wider planters, and more chemical inputs, all financed at soaring interest rates. The local John Deere dealer was doing record business selling new equipment on credit, promising that expansion was the only way to survive. Go big or go home became the slogan of the time. Many farmers borrowed tens of thousands of dollars, believing new technology would solve their problems. But Evelyn saw the danger clearly. New equipment meant new payments. Payments that had to be made whether the crop was good or bad, whether prices fell or the weather turned against them. Her chickens, on the other hand, represented true self-sufficiency. They cost little to start, produced steady income every single week, and could be expanded slowly using profits from the first flock. No banker owned them. No monthly note hung over their heads like a storm cloud. In a time when everything else on the farm felt uncertain and expensive, Evelyn's chicken project offered something rare: control. It was a small bet on patience and resourcefulness rather than a big gamble on debt and scale. And as the weeks turned into months, those 200 chicks grew into a healthy, productive flock. A living example of the kind of old-fashioned thinking that many were too proud or too desperate to consider. The days following Evelyn's decision brought a storm of doubt far stronger than the prairie winds. Word spread quickly through the rural grapevine, and the mockery came from every direction. At the local co-op, where farmers gathered for coffee and supplies, her name became a punchline. "Did you hear about Tom Harper's wife?" One man would say with a grin. "She's starting a chicken hotel," while the rest of us are fighting for our lives. Laughter would roll through the store as men slapped counters and shook their heads. Even Tom, who loved her, struggled to hide his frustration. One evening after a long day in the field, he sat at the kitchen table and finally spoke his mind. "Evelyn, this chicken business, it's foolish. We're staring down the barrel of foreclosure and you're out there playing farm wife with 200 birds that aren't going to pay the note on the tractor. The bank doesn't take eggs as payment." His voice carried exhaustion and worry, the weight of a man who felt everything resting on his shoulders. The neighbors were even less kinder. Harlan stopped by one afternoon while Evelyn was scattering feed. "You really think those chickens are going to save this place?" he asked, unable to keep the smirk off his face. "Tom's out here trying to run a real farm and you're counting on breakfast food." "Wake up, Evelyn. This isn't the 1930s anymore." Dale, who was with him, laughed loudly. "Next thing you know, she'll be selling cookies at the roadside. Good luck when the auctioneer shows up." The emotional pressure on Evelyn was immense. She heard the whispers at church, felt the pitying looks from other farm wives, and carried the heavy silence from her own husband every night. Some mornings she would stand at the shed door, listening to the cheerful cheeping of her growing flock, and wonder if they were all right, if she was being stubborn and blind while her family's future slipped away. The weight of skepticism pressed down on her, testing her resolve daily. Yet through it all, Evelyn kept working in quiet determination. She didn't argue or defend herself loudly. She simply rose earlier each morning, tended to her birds with care, collected the first small batches of eggs, and sold them at the roadside stand she had built from scrap wood. While the men debated bigger loans and newer equipment at the coffee shop, she focused on the one thing she could control without asking the bank for permission. The ridicule hurt, but it also strengthened something deep inside her. Every laugh and every doubtful word became fuel for her quiet persistence. She believed, with a certainty the others couldn't see, that small, honest efforts had saved families before and could do so again. As the months passed and the farm's financial troubles deepened, Evelyn held her course, even as the chorus of skepticism grew louder around her. The days following Evelyn's decision brought a storm of doubt far stronger than the prairie winds. Word spread quickly through the rural grapevine, and the mockery came from every direction. At the local co-op, where farmers gathered for coffee and supplies, her name became a punchline. "Did you hear about Tom Harper's wife?" one man would say with a grin. "She's starting a chicken hotel while the rest of us are fighting for our lives." Laughter would roll through the store as men slapped counters and shook their heads. Even Tom, who loved her, struggled to hide his frustration. One evening after a long day in the field, he sat at the kitchen table and finally spoke his mind. "Evelyn, this chicken business, it's foolish. We're staring down the barrel of foreclosure, and you're out there playing farm wife with 200 birds that aren't going to pay the note on the tractor. The bank doesn't take eggs as payment." His voice carried exhaustion and worry, the weight of a man who felt everything resting on his shoulders. The neighbors were even less kinder. Harlan stopped by one afternoon while Evelyn was scattering feed. "You really think those chickens are going to save this place?" he asked, unable to keep the smirk off his face. "Tom's out here trying to run a real farm and you're counting on breakfast food." "Wake up, Evelyn. This isn't the 1930s anymore." Dale, who was with him, laughed loudly. "Next thing you know, she'll be selling cookies at the roadside. Good luck when the auctioneer shows up." The emotional pressure on Evelyn was immense. She heard the whispers at church, felt the pitying looks from other farm wives, and carried the heavy silence from her own husband every night. Some mornings she would stand at the shed door, listening to the cheerful cheeping of her growing flock, and wonder if they were all right, if she was being stubborn and blind while her family's future slipped away. The weight of skepticism pressed down on her, testing her resolve daily. Yet through it all, Evelyn kept working in quiet determination. She didn't argue or defend herself loudly. She simply rose earlier each morning, tended to her birds with care, collected the first small batches of eggs, and sold them at the roadside stand she had built from scrap wood. While the men debated bigger loans and newer equipment at the coffee shop, she focused on the one thing she could control without asking the bank for permission. The ridicule hurt, but it also strengthened something deep inside her. Every laugh and every doubtful word became fuel for her quiet persistence. She believed, with a certainty the others couldn't see, that small, honest efforts had saved families before and could do so again. As the months passed and the farm's financial troubles deepened, Evelyn held her course, even as the chorus of skepticism grew louder around her. The next 3 years tested Evelyn's resolve in ways no one could have predicted. What began as 200 fragile chicks slowly grew into a productive flock, but not without hardship. In the first year, disease swept through the shed during a wet spring. Evelyn lost nearly 40 birds to coccidiosis before she learned to use her grandmother's old remedies of garlic water and careful sanitation. Predators came too, raccoons and foxes that tested her makeshift fences at night. Yet there were small victories. By summer's end, the surviving hens began laying steadily. Evelyn's roadside egg stand started bringing in $60 to $80 a month. Modest money, but money that was hers, with no payment due to the bank. While Evelyn fought these small battles and celebrated quiet wins, the larger farm was sliding deeper into trouble. Tom's new tractor loan payments had risen sharply as interest rates climbed past 18%. The old combine broke down during harvest, forcing them to hire a neighbor at a cost they could barely afford. Corn prices continued to fall, and every trip to the elevator brought worse news. The bank letters grew more urgent, threatening foreclosure if payments fell further behind. The second year brought more challenges for Evelyn. Market fluctuations hit hard when egg prices dropped in the fall. She adapted by selling dressed chickens to local families and baking rich pies for the county fair, turning potential loss into small profit. The flock grew to over 300 birds through careful breeding. But on the main farm, tension reached new heights. Tom's equipment kept failing, and another loan for fertilizer left them even more leveraged. Neighbors who had laughed at Evelyn were now quietly losing ground themselves. Several farms in the county held auctions that year, a painful sight that hung over every kitchen table conversation. By the third year, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Evelyn's chicken operation had become remarkably efficient. She had built a second small coop using only salvaged materials and was now generating nearly $200 a month in steady income. The birds provided meat for their own table and extra cash for necessities. Yet the Harper farm as a whole stood on the edge of collapse. Debt had mounted to crushing levels. The bank had set a final deadline, and one more bad season would end everything. Tom worked longer hours, his face etched with exhaustion, while Evelyn continued her daily work with the flock, calm on the outside, carrying her own silent fears inside. 3 years of small struggles and small victories for Evelyn. 3 years of growing desperation for the farm Tom was fighting to save. The gap between her quiet approach and the heavy debt model had never been wider. As another harsh Iowa winter approached, both of them sensed that something had to give. The breaking point came on a cold November evening in 1985. The bank had given its final notice, unless the Harpers caught up on 3 missed payments by the end of the month. The farm would go to auction. Tom came in from the barn, his shoulders slumped in defeat, carrying the latest letter from the bank like a death sentence. The kitchen light cast long shadows across the worn table, where they had shared so many meals and so many worries over the years. Evelyn set a plate of warm food in front of him, but Tom barely touched it. "It's over, Evelyn," he said, his voice cracking. "They're taking it. Everything we worked for. The land, the house, all of it. I borrowed too much. The tractor, the fertilizer, the extra ground. It was supposed to save us, but it's buried us instead." Evelyn sat down across from him, calm but with tears glistening in her eyes. She reached for the old ledger she had kept hidden in the drawer and placed it gently on the table. "Tom," she said softly, "it's not over." He looked up, confused and exhausted. "What are you talking about?" For the first time, she opened the ledger and turned the pages slowly. "The chickens," she said. "They've been paying for groceries, fuel for the truck, clothes for the kids, and part of the property taxes for nearly 2 years now. Last month alone, between eggs, dressed birds, and those pies I sell at the market, we brought in $268. That's money the bank can't touch because we never borrowed to make it." Tom stared at the neat columns of numbers, his hands trembling slightly. "All this time, while I was out there fighting with the bank and watching equipment break down, you were. I wasn't trying to prove you wrong," Evelyn said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I was trying to keep our family standing. You carried the heavy load of the big farm. I just wanted something small that was truly ours. No payments, no interest, no risk of losing everything if one crop failed." Tears welled up in Tom's eyes as the weight of 3 years of doubt and mockery finally hit him. He reached across the table and took her hands. "I laughed at you," he whispered, voice thick with regret. The neighbors laughed. "I thought you were being unrealistic, while I was being the responsible one. But you were the one keeping us alive." The kitchen fell quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. In that moment, Tom realized the painful truth. His big, debt-heavy approach had brought them to the edge of ruin, while Evelyn's small, patient, paid-for flock had become their lifeline. The chickens weren't just birds. They were the one part of the farm that was truly free. For the first time in years, Tom looked at his wife with fresh eyes, not with doubt, but with deep respect and gratitude. The confrontation at that old kitchen table didn't end their problems, but it changed everything between them. What happened to the Harper family that cold November night was not unique to their 240 acres in Iowa. It was playing out in kitchens across the American Midwest during the brutal farm crisis of the 1980s. Between 1981 and 1987, more than 230,000 family farms went out of business. Entire rural communities were hollowed out as banks called in loans that had once seemed manageable. Equipment auctions became weekly events, heartbreaking spectacles where tractors, combines, and land that had been in families for generations were sold for pennies on the dollar. Fathers who could no longer face the shame sometimes took their own lives. Marriages crumbled under the pressure. Children watched their parents lose everything they had worked for. The crisis had many causes. Skyrocketing interest rates, falling crop prices, and the grain embargo all played their part. But at the heart of it was the same philosophy Tom had followed: borrow big, grow big, bet on the future. Dealers, bankers, and even government experts had pushed farmers to expand using debt. Get big or get out, they said. Thousands listened, and thousands lost. Yet in the middle of this devastation, a quieter group of farmers survived. Not always the biggest or the most modern, but those who, like Evelyn, kept some part of their operation small, paid for, and under their own control. Side enterprises, a few acres of vegetables, a small herd of cattle, a flock of chickens, a roadside stand, became lifelines. While the main farm bled money to interest payments and broken equipment, these humble projects generated steady cash flow that didn't depend on volatile commodity prices or massive loans. Evelyn's chickens were exactly that kind of lifeline. In an era when many families lost their land because one bad year could destroy their ability to make payments, her flock provided income every single week. No matter how low corn prices fell or how high interest rates climbed, eggs still sold and birds still grew. This small, debt-free enterprise gave the Harpers breathing room when the big farm could not. It bought them time. It kept food on the table and hope alive. Across the Corn Belt, thousands of other quiet heroes did similar things. One farmer kept bees. Another maintained an old orchard. A widow raised rabbits. These were not flashy solutions. They were old-fashioned, patient, and paid for in full. While the experts and bankers shook their heads, these small enterprises carried many families through the worst economic disaster rural America had faced since the Great Depression. The Harper story, like so many others, proved a painful but powerful truth. When everything else failed, it was often the simplest, most self-reliant parts of the farm, the ones free from debt, that made the difference between losing everything and living to fight another day. In the years that followed that emotional night at the kitchen table, the Harper family's story took a different path than so many others in rural Iowa. Thanks in large part to Evelyn's chickens, they managed to hold on to their 240 acres. The steady income from the flock helped them catch up on the most pressing debts and gave Tom enough breathing room to restructure the farm more carefully. They never lost the land. By the early 1990s, Evelyn's small operation had grown into something remarkable. What started with 200 chicks had expanded to a thriving flock of over 200 birds. She added more coops built from salvaged materials and began supplying eggs and poultry to local stores and restaurants. The once mocked chicken lady became a respected figure in the community. Neighbors who had laughed years earlier now came to her for advice on starting their own small side enterprises. Even Tom proudly told people, "My wife's chicken saved this farm when nothing else could." The long-term impact ran far deeper than the land or the money. Their 2 children, raised watching their mother's quiet determination, learned lessons that would stay with them for life. Their son Mark took over much of the main farm work, but always kept a small, debt-free operation running on the side, just as his mother had taught him. Their daughter Sarah started her own small egg business when she bought her first house, refusing to take on unnecessary loans. Years later, when grandchildren gathered at the farm, Evelyn would take them out to the chicken coops, the same ones built from scrap and love, and tell them the story. They laughed at Grandma's chickens, she would say with a gentle smile. But those chickens kept our family here. The grandchildren grew up understanding the power of patience. self-reliance, and creating value from what you already have instead of borrowing for what looks impressive. Tom passed away in 2008, but not before he had publicly thanked Evelyn many times for her wisdom. The farm remains in the family today, now run by their grandson with the same careful philosophy. The chicken operation is still active, smaller now, but still producing. And every spring when new chicks arrive, someone in the family remembers that windy morning in 1982 when everyone laughed at Evelyn Harper. Her simple idea didn't just save the farm for a season. It changed the way her family thought about money, risk, and survival for generations. In a time when so many farms disappeared, the Harper place stood strong, not because they went bigger or borrowed more, but because one woman had the courage to try something small, honest, and completely paid for. At the heart of Evelyn Harper's story lies a truth that echoes far beyond one Iowa farm. It's not about chickens. It's about ownership. What you truly own, you control. What owns you, the loans, the payments, the monthly notes, eventually controls your destiny. In a world that constantly pushes us to go bigger, borrow more, and chase the newest solution, Evelyn showed the quiet power of small, consistent actions and humble ideas that don't require anyone's permission. She didn't wait for the bank's approval. She didn't need the neighbor's blessing. She simply used what she had, applied the wisdom of those who came before her, and created something steady in an uncertain world. That is the real lesson of this story. The smallest, most practical decisions made with patience and self-reliance often become the very things that carry us through the hardest times. The Harpers didn't just save their farm. They saved their family's way of life, their dignity, and their future. And they did it not by getting louder or going deeper into debt, but by staying true to old-fashioned values that still work today. If this story touched something in you, if you grew up watching a parent or grandparent hold onto the farm through hard times with nothing but grit and simple ideas, then Evelyn's story is your story too. Tell us in the comments, did a small, humble idea or an old-fashioned approach ever save the day for your family? What crazy decision turned out to be the smartest one you or your loved ones ever made? Your stories matter. They keep this wisdom alive for the next generation. Thank you for watching. The 1980s taught us many hard lessons, but perhaps the most important one still stands today. What you own outright will always outlast what owns you.